there are 200 million, but virtually every white person in the United States participates in the system of racism and white supremacy. Some do it more actively than others. Some do it more on purpose, if you will, than others, but that we all end up participating in it in some way, shape, or form. And some do it very deliberately, very much on purpose. Some do it in an attempt to injure non-white peoples. Other people do it somewhat not as actively, not realizing in some occasions that they're involved in that process. But I think we're all involved in it, all 200 million white people basically at some level.
Okay, that'll be all for now.
Context of white supremacy, Gus T. Renegade, Justice, and the admitted white supremacist known as Tim Wise. Couple things I heard as we went through the discussion. I just want to, I asked this question when you were on the program June 1, 2009, Mr. Wise. I asked, do you harm non-white people consciously and or subconsciously, directly and or indirectly? Do you harm individuals because they are not white? And you said yes. Is that still your response to that question?
Yes, and the question...
Okay, wait a minute. Hang on, please, sir. Hang on, I'm not done. I definitely want to hear your response to that, but I'm not done. I'm not playing games. This is very important. And this is really at the crux of my view on the admitted white supremacist known as Tim Wise. The problem is, when Justice just asked that question, we could have got the same answer you just gave.
No,
the presentations where I've seen, wait a minute, you're still interrupting me. I have not, and I want to point this out. I haven't interrupted you the entire program. Let you talk. I would like the same courtesy. I'm about courtesy. You asked Justice, I'm about courtesy. I'm going to listen to you respectfully. I would like the same courtesy. Thank you. Now, I've seen you live and in person. I have listened to you on other broadcasts. This is your third trip to this broadcast. This is the only program where I hear you say all white people. It is impossible to be white in a system of white supremacy and not be culpable at some level. I don't hear that on other programs. I don't hear you freely concede, yes, I harm individuals because they are not white. I do not hear you freely concede that on other programs. And even bigger than that, the biggest issue of them all, when I look at the results, the non-white people who hear you speak, particularly in person, they do not leave with the impression that, oh, wow, Tim Wise participates in the system of white supremacy. Every white person at some level is participating in this system. They don't leave with that impression. They leave with the impression that Tim Wise is an incredible guy. I love Tim Wise. When I have spoke with non-white people who have seen you speak and said, Tim Wise admitted to harming non-white people on my program, they look at me as if I'm speaking another language. It is incomprehensible to them that you could practice racism in any way. And I have to believe this is done deliberately on your part. I could be incorrect, but I have to suspect that because when you were on the program in June, you said repeatedly the thing that bothers you most is when you see non-white people and they're not suspicious. When they're not suspicious of you and not suspicious of white people. You said it's logical for non-white people, victims of white supremacy, to be suspicious of all white people, no exception. You said that is your greatest concern, and I see no evidence that you act on that concern when you speak to non-white people. I am done, and I'm eager to hear your response, sir.
Very good. First of all, the way that you asked the question to me and back in June, and the way that you phrased it at the beginning of your statement there, is very different than the way that Justice phrased it. So when you suggest that I could have given the same answer to Justice that I gave to you, you're assuming the questions were identical, and they were not, and you know they were not. Justice asked the question, am I a racist? You asked the question, do I harm either directly or indirectly, consciously or subconsciously, non-white peoples? Those are not, to my understanding, the same question. So that is why I answered Justice the way I did and the way that I answered you the way I did back in June. Now, as for whether I harm people directly, indirectly, consciously, or unconsciously, I answered yes, and I would answer yes again, because I believe, and I think that the research on this subject says it is true, not only about me, but about white folks generally in this culture. And what the research says is that the implicit biases that are often, frankly, very subconscious, they're not always consciously held, they are often subconscious, nonetheless can affect behavior. They don't always affect it. They won't affect it every time. They will not control a white person 100% of the time, not even necessarily half of the time. But what they can do is that those implicit biases, those implicit prejudices, those implicit stereotypes, which I believe we all internalize under a system of white supremacy, can, in certain situations, at certain times, under certain conditions, manifest as behavior. And when I answered the question you put in June to me as a yes, what I was saying is I know from experience that there have been times when those thoughts have come into my head, and I know there have no doubt been times when I have acted on them in some way, sometimes subtly. I don't think that I have ever acted on them in a deliberate and overt way, but I don't think it would be honest for me to say that I've never acted on them in a subtle way or in a way that wasn't in some regard discriminatory. So I answered the question yes, because I can't imagine that the answer would be no. In a system like this, I don't see how I could not have engaged in some practice which was disadvantageous to and harmful to people of color. Even if I can't rattle them off, sort of 1 to 100, I'm sure that they have happened. Now, as for whether or not I make this clear to my audiences or whether or not they understand this to be true, I have for approximately 20 years that I have been engaged in the battle for what I call racial justice and equity. I have said repeatedly, I have written it in my books, I have written it in essays, and I have spoken it on innumerable radio programs and probably even television, though I can't recall for certain, that I believe that anyone raised in this culture will internalize the norms of white supremacy. And I specify specifically that whites will all internalize those things as white supremacist thoughts, and that non-white peoples or people of color will internalize them in a way that becomes what we call internalized oppression. They will affect everyone. So I've said it repeatedly, not just on your show. I've said it many, many times. I may not have said it exactly using the verbiage that you prefer and the wording that you prefer given the question the way you phrase it, but I have said that or its functional equivalent on hundreds of occasions. As for in my speeches, you and your friends came to the talk that I gave in Seattle a year or so ago. You actually came into the speech late, so I'm not sure whether or not that part where I discuss the way that we're all affected by white supremacy was before you came in or whether it wasn't in that speech. It may not have been in that speech. I don't give the same speech every time. I don't make the exact same points every time. When I'm asked to come in and I'm asked to give a particular talk speaking to a particular thing, it may or may not come up. It usually does, frankly, in my talks, either in the speech itself or as was the case when you and your friends came into the talk at the church that evening during the question and answer session where one of your friends, I don't believe it was you who did it, but one of your friends asked the question, and I said at the time in front of several hundred people, a large number of whom, if not the majority of whom, were non-white peoples, that absolutely I'm implicated in the system of racism and white supremacy. I've internalized those norms just like everyone else. And the people in the room, to my knowledge, were not shocked by my saying it. They didn't go, oh, my goodness, what is he confessing to? In fact, the conversations that I have had with folks of color, with, as you prefer, non-white peoples after my talks, almost invariably lead to a discussion of this very issue, how I and other white folks have internalized these norms, but how I and other white folks, some of us, are trying, maybe successfully and maybe not successfully, but trying as valiantly as we know how to challenge that conditioning in ourselves, to challenge the system that bestows that conditioning upon us, and to challenge the norms of that society. We may not be good at it. We may not be doing the job, and I totally agree with the comments that you made at the outset and the comments that I heard Mr. Fuller make about, the proof is in the pudding. It's about outcome, not yardage. I couldn't agree more. I understand that. That makes perfect sense to me. But I do think that as we try to challenge the system of white supremacy, whether we are white folks trying to do that, whether we are non-white folks trying to do that, the fact is it doesn't change overnight because I stand up or anyone stands up and gives a talk or writes an article or does anything else. All these tools that we use are merely tools to try to break down that particular wall. And the fact that I haven't succeeded at it, that you haven't succeeded at it, that Mr. Fuller hasn't succeeded at it, that none of us have, doesn't change the fact that we may still be committed to that cause. So I am concerned when people overtrust, and I have repeatedly said, look, you have to always wonder. In fact, this was asked to me at a speech not long ago, within the last month, where I was asked the question about whether or not, it was a non-white person asking me whether they should be suspicious of white people, and they were actually saying something to the effect of that they felt bad, that they suspected all white people. And my answer to that individual, who was a college student, was very directly that it made perfect sense for them to suspect all white folks, including those of us who talk about this issue, because we have stake in the game, so to speak. We have stake in the game as people who benefit from the system. And so even when we are trying to challenge it, there is always the possibility that we can be co-opted, that we can fall short of our goals, and that they should be on guard. And I made that point very directly. And people did not say, oh, my goodness, what does he just confess to? I can't believe he would say that. In fact, people appreciated the honesty. So I'm trying to be honest when I make that comment. I am not trying to get non-white people to follow me, believe in me, love me. I could not care less about that. And I'm very specifically on point when they ask that question, when any non-white person, or white person for that matter, ask that question. I always make the point that as long as the system is in place, it makes perfect sense to be suspicious of white people in terms of their commitment to really changing that system. It always should be about actions and not just words, and I totally believe that to be true.
Okay. I want to point this out before I respond and then move to my next question. I do not believe you. I want to be very clear. I do not believe you, and I have seen no evidence to believe what you just said, and I want to point this out. Wait a minute. I didn't interrupt you. We just heard you speak for quite a while. No interruptions. From myself for justice, I would like the same courtesy. Thank you. Now, number one, Mr. Wise has a tendency, and he's been on the program 3 times. You can check the archives and see if I am speaking truthfully. Mr. Wise and many other white people who allege to be against racism, white supremacy, a tactic that they will use, I suspect consciously, to practice racism, white supremacy. They will agree with what you say. Mr. Wise just agreed with everything I said. Non-white people, victims of white supremacy, it is logical that they be suspicious of every white person, no exception, including him, regardless of how many books he writes, regardless of how many lectures he gives. You should be suspicious until the system of white supremacy ends. And in fact, even agreed with the very beginning of the broadcast, Mr. Neely Fuller Jr., a victim of white supremacy, his statement, we do not award or praise yardage. We want the problem solved, the system of white supremacy replaced with a system of justice, not hordes of white people writing books and talking about racism while the system continues to obliterate non-white people worldwide. But what they will do, and I suspect this is conscious, is speak for an extended amount of time while agreeing with what you said and saying all these things that are contradictory to that. Now, I want to point this out very clearly for anyone. Mr. Wise, he's all over the web. He's on YouTube. He's probably coming to a town near you soon. He's been on this program twice. I have heard him speak consistently, and the non-white people who've listened to him and have been in the audience, they do not leave with a suspicion of Mr. Wise or other white people who work against racism, white supremacy. In fact, I have observed the exact opposite. And the fact that you're not bringing that up, I strongly suspect you are consciously practicing racism, white supremacy. I have observed non-white people clamor to you as though you are God from the heavens when you come to speak about racism. I believe Mr. Fuller has observed the exact same thing. I do not see you saying, whoa, 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 really, you should be suspicious. You don't want to be running and getting my autograph. You should suspect